Have you ever been reading something in the Old Testament and you're thinking, hold on, wait a minute here. This does not sound like God. It definitely doesn't sound like the loving Father of Jesus. Hi, my name is Martin Trench. You can find out more about me on martintrench.com. And this week in my school community, we are going to be looking at how to read the Old Testament in a way that is spiritually fulfilling and nourishing, rather than trying to justify things that we know in our hearts are not justifiable. In 2 Samuel 24, there's a story about how David did something wrong, and there's a lot of contradictions about that story that are hard for people to understand. But at the end of it, God decides to punish David, and he gives David three choices of what the punishment would be. It's like you will have I think it's 3 weeks of famine, or you will have 3 months of running from your enemies, or you'll have 3 months of plague. Maybe it's 3 days of plague. I can't remember, but there's a choice between running from your enemies, having a famine, and having a plague. And David says, oh my goodness, all these things are terrible. I will let God decide what punishment it should be, because he is merciful. So God decides on the plague, and 70,000 people die. That is mass murder. That's a genocide. 70,000 people die, and that is apparently God showing mercy. And the reason they die is not because they did something wrong, but because David did. Now let me ask you a question. Does that sound like the Father that Jesus came to preach about? Does that sound like the Good Shepherd who would leave the 99 and go after the one lost sheep? Does that sound like the Father welcoming back the prodigal son without any punishment, and in fact lots of blessings? It doesn't really fit, does it? And you know, there's other places in the Old Testament where things happen that when we read the Gospels and we read Jesus, they don't fit. The disciples say to Jesus, will we call fire down on that unbelieving town like Elijah did? And Jesus said, what? You don't even know what spirit that comes from. The Son of Man did not come to take people's lives, but to give life. So how do we understand those things? Well, that's what we're going to be looking at in my school community. And it's not the simple answer that people like to give. Well, that was the old covenant, and God acted one way under the old covenant, and then he acted another way under the new covenant. God does not change. I am the Lord, I do not change, Malachi says. James says there is no shadow of turning with him, or as the New Living Translation puts it, he does not change like shifting shadows. Hebrews tells us Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. It is not true that God had an anger management problem in the Old Testament, but because Jesus shed his blood, it kind of softened God's heart a bit, and now he's nice. God is love. God was always love and always will be love. How do you explain those really difficult passages in the Old Testament? Join me in school. I'll be sharing some information and we'll get to talk about it. Go to martintrench.com for more information.